Who/were the most ruthless businessmen in history? What are examples of their ruthlessness? Peter Spurring. The Sampoong shopping center collapse. During South Korea's economic boom in the 1980s, Sampoong was erected in Seoul. Originally planned to be an apartment complex, a new boss by the name of Lee Joon decided midway that he wanted it to become a shopping center instead. This required changes to the plans, most notably the removal of several support columns so that escalators could be installed. Due to serious constructional concerns, the construction company refused to carry out these changes, leading Lee to fire them and bringing in his own builders. His further demands meant there were other issues with the completed building too. There was no steel skeleton or crossbeams, which meant that load couldn't be transferred across floors. He also ordered the floor columns to be reduced to below the safe thickness, to maximize floor space, and had them spread further out, increasing the load on each for the same reason. 3 air conditioning units weighing 15 tons each were installed on the roof, exceeding the load capacity by 4 times. Cracks in the building started to appear just a few short years after opening, after the air conditioning units were dragged across the roof, causing cracks. By April 1995, more cracks were beginning to appear on the 5th floor too. Lee and the management's only response was to move merchandise from the top floor to the basement. Just a couple of months later, the cracks multiplied dramatically. The management's response was to close the top floors. They invited civil engineers to inspect the building, who quickly came to the conclusion that the building was at risk of collapse. The directors suggested to Lee Joon that the building be evacuated, but Lee angrily rejected the idea, saying he didn't want to lose revenue. It was very much one rule for them, though, as Lee was more than happy to evacuate himself alongside the other executives. Do you know who was working in the building at the time? His daughter-in-law. He didn't even tell her. At 5 p.m. on the June 29, 1995, the 5th floor ceiling began to sink. Still, Lee did not close the store or order any emergency repairs. Nearly an hour later, audible cracking sounds filled the building, prompting staff to sound the alarms and evacuate the customers. However, it was too late. The roof collapsed and the air conditioning behemoths dropped through it, smashing through each and every floor. The main columns buckled and within less than 20 seconds, the south wing of the building came crashing down, killing over 500 people and injuring over 900 more. It took a days-long rescue effort to free the trapped survivors, some of whom surviving the contemporaneous hot weather by drinking rainwater. By contrast, some of the trapped victims survived the collapse but drowned to death because of the water used to suppress the fire. The collapse was investigated by one Professor Chung, a civil engineering professor. During his interrogation of Lee, the latter disregarded the victims and stated his primary concern was the financial damage suffered by his company. He was ultimately arrested, convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He only served 7 but died shortly after release anyway. Lee Joon turned ruthlessness into an art form. He was utterly selfish and devoid of humanity. It's an incredibly rare time when I say this of anyone, but I'm glad that waste of air is dead. 232K views. View 9,222 upvotes. Chukwabuka Sunday. The man that comes to mind is James Brock. He was a hotelier. When Martin Luther King Jr. came to have his lunch at the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine, Florida, he was turned down, arrested and jailed for trespassing. The property he stepped in was meant for the whites. While in prison, Luther wrote a letter to a religious leader, Rabbi Israel Dresner, who gathered his men for a protest. The protest was heated and the owner went bananas. Image: James Brock pouring acid into the swimming pool. When some of the protesters jumped into the motel swimming pool, James Brock decided to take the matters into his own hands by pouring a gallon of hydrochloric acid into the swimming pool to burn their skin. The incident led to the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which disallowed discrimination on the basis of religion, race, color, sex, or national origin. 159.9K views. View 2,689 upvotes. Tony Plank. Outside of organized crime, few businessmen could keep pace with Rockefeller when it came to ruthlessness. How he came to be such a miserable excuse for a human being is complex. Perhaps it starts with having a notorious father, William Rockefeller, who was at one point literally a snake oil salesman. Or perhaps it was angst over his father's bigamy or having to relocate as a teenager to avoid dad's indictment on rape charges. However he came to be the quintessential Scrooge character, he played the part with a thoroughness that Dickens would have appreciated had Rockefeller been fictional. In spite of being the second wealthiest man in history, he famously lived well beneath his means and kept handwritten ledgers of personal expenses up until his death. In business, he was as relentless toward competition as he was toward his own happiness. Rockefeller is quoted as once saying, "Competition is sin." He certainly did his best to eliminate this particular sin. This is the man that created the modern concept of monopoly, and United States law still bears marks from the battle to disassemble his creation, Standard Oil. He was most famous for the dirty tactic of making secret deals with the railroads that allowed Standard to ship its product at a lower effective rate than his takeover targets. But there is virtually no underhanded device that Rockefeller did not employ in the service of crushing the sin of competition. Standard would go so far as to buy all of the local barrels so as to prevent competitors from being able to store their product. And when all else failed, Standard would price oil as low as necessary to drive the smaller refiners out of business or coerce them into agreeing to be purchased by Rockefeller. Many modern biographers often have a more moderate take on Rockefeller. Late in life, he had his own Scrooge-like conversion as he tried to escape his sobriquet of the most hated man in America through philanthropy. But it is hard to forget the serious young businessman who found competition sinful and was willing to use bribery and coercion to build his empire. Hopefully, somewhere between his profligate crushing of competition and his conversion to the endower of universities and hospitals, he found what he needed to rest in peace. 383K views. View 1,320 upvotes.